I'm sure everyone really has been inspired and learned a lot from your lessons this week on the Al-Badia, if I say it correctly, project. And before we start, I also wanted to introduce, I haven't seen who else is here, but at least Ashley, because maybe not everyone knows Ashley, and well, maybe you want to say something about yourself.
You might have seen my name popping up in various places. I work for ecosystem restoration camps and was the person who came up with the idea of this course because I was looking for something similar myself and couldn't find it. I did a PDC and felt like it didn't give me enough information to actually implement create and then implement a restoration design. I wanted to have a business element in it so that people felt empowered with the knowledge to create a regenerative enterprise that would fund an ecosystem restoration project. And I've been working with Inga and some other amazing volunteers and the Gaia Education team for about 1.5 years now to put this course together. So it's been a real labour of love, and I'm delighted to see so many people signing up as students to take it. And I'm really excited to see what you're all going to do with this knowledge after the course is finished. So please do keep in touch. And thanks for being here.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So Neal, well, over to you, really.
Over to me.
We have a bunch of questions, and I also want to invite everyone to put any additional questions in the chat if they come up. Yeah, maybe you want to say a little bit more first about the video that you shared with us, because it's new.
It's just the last update and kind of the last thing that I'm doing for the project. I haven't been full-time on the project since early 2018. And I've been in the States for the bulk of that time, but I was able to go back last fall and follow up on some things with the princesses who funded the project, and with and visit the people again and get those last shots. We had gone 2.5 years with no rainfall. I had left, and I had seen some shots from the Bedouin who I'm still in touch with and WhatsApp with regularly. But I knew that 2018 and 2019, we got rain both years in a row, which had only happened once in the 10 years before, right? Usually if you get rain one year, you're not getting rain for at least another 12 to 16 months generally. So I knew that I needed to get back and see what happened. I honestly didn't know. And so I went back last fall. I got those last images, got to spend a good week with the people, and then pursue some side projects in the region. And since then, I've kind of been sitting on that video and those images, and I just knew that I needed to get them out. And it seemed to me that this week was a fine week because it's World Environment Day, is that what it is? But also because there's so much bad news going on right now, and I was like, well, let's see if we can put out some good news. So that's how that came about, and it's just the overview of the whole story in a very truncated form. It's clearly not the whole story, because there were other aspects of the project that I was involved in and that lots of other people were involved in, with respect to infrastructure and housing and coordination between multiple government ministries and all sorts of other stuff. But it's the story of my part and what I was there to do.
Yeah.
And so that's the video. Should I start with the questions that I got sent? Do we want to?
Well, we can.
Do this?
Yeah, I was going to read them out and have a look at all the topics.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I did see a question in the chat already from Meg. And she's wondering how the tree survived for these 2 years without any rain, which, yeah, it's very impressive. It's very moving, actually, to see.
That's just a function of design. That's what it is. It's species selection and figuring out the water system is what it is. There are plenty of trees that will survive 2 years without rain.
Right. So you
Right.
had some certainty that they would still be alive, but rain needed to come at some
Well,
point.
and it was a question of which ones, right? Because we trialed species from Mexico, from India. I would have trialed from Namibia, but I couldn't get a hold of the seed, as well as natives, all of which we thought would survive or had a good chance, but we didn't know which ones. And so it was a bit of a, well, we can't design product. We can't design what goods we're going to sell or go into launching that unless we know what really scales. Right.
Yeah.
But in terms of how do they survive for 2 years, there are all sorts of adaptations that desert trees have to be able to do that. Whether it's hydraulic redistribution or really tiny leaves or really interesting ways of reducing evapotranspiration. There's lots of different mechanisms that different sorts of trees have for surviving deserts.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the reason why we went primarily with a tree-based system rather than a grass-based one. You'll have learned from Precious all about how animals can be either a positive or a negative impact on the land depending on management.
Precious's video is in the next module. So.
Oh, that's the next one. Okay, so you're going to learn that from Precious. And the reason why we didn't take that approach, which is more of an Alan Savory type approach, is because the context just didn't allow for it, which is why we went primarily with a tree-based system.
And then there's a question from Adib who was saying, did you plant seeds or saplings? Did you have to establish a nursery? And with grazing, I guess we'll come back to the grazing later on.
Come back to the grazing. We planted with the native species, we planted from seed. With the non-native, we contracted with the nursery to get them and planted them as saplings.
Okay.
Did you collect the seed from nearby other natural places, or did you buy them?
We did with a couple, and with a couple we had to buy them because there weren't any locally.
Yeah.
For instance, there's an Arabian moringa tree called Moringa peregrina. It's never been domesticated, and it's known to Bedouin tribes in Egypt and in Yemen and in Oman. And that one came across my radar. It took me 1.5 years to find a supply for that seed. That one we bought, but we planted it from seed.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah. So it wasn't so easy to get. I guess when we're on the topic of trees, we see a few more questions popping up about. Well, you're talking about climate analogs in your lesson, so you're weren't just using the native species, but also the non-natives.
Right.
But
someone asked about Faithurbia. I never did plant it. It was on my list of ones to trial, but I couldn't find it locally, and importing seeds is really hard. So there were a number of trees I would have liked to have trialed that I never got to, primarily African ones.
Do you mean importing was hard because of regulations, or just to get your hands in?
Yeah, because of regulations.
Right. So and how does that? I guess that is going to be different per country.
Sure.
How it's limited. Yeah. Okay. There's quite a few questions about water management as well. Maybe a first one a bit more high level, which I also was curious about when the question was asked, that in the lessons you show a map of the water stress per country.
Yeah.
However, countries like Belgium has then on that map extreme high stress, and Egypt has low to medium stress. And then the question, to explain this really, what that means.
I mean, it's that's sourced from the World Resources Institute, which is a very, very reputable organization. My understanding of how they calculate that, which could be completely wrong, by the way, but they're looking at things like aquifer depletion and surface water availability and consumption trends, right? So I suspect that what's going on is Belgium's using more water than they've got in agriculture. Agriculture tends to be 80% of a country's consumption, whereas Egypt has the Nile, and it always will, unless Ethiopia builds the dam. We had someone from Ethiopia in here, didn't we? Yeah. Let's not get into that right now.
Yeah, don't get into that. You're right.
Okay, I hope that clarifies that map a little bit. Then some more questions on the water would be specifically about the water budget. So the question is from Peter, and he says, to which level of detail did you manage to make the water budget? And how did that actually?
So what we did was, with our swaling system, we knew exactly how long and how wide every swale was. So when we got rain, all we had to do was measure the level to which the water came, and then we could calculate exactly how much we caught in those earthworks, right? That's how we knew. We actually caught more than that, because that doesn't account for all the biological sequestration of water that would have happened higher up in the mountain. So it's not high level accuracy. It was very low tech measurement, but it is ballpark, right?
Yeah,
it is ballpark numbers. I would have loved to be able to measure evapotranspiration rates, but I didn't have the bandwidth or the resources to deal with that.
right. And I think you also mentioned the water usage. So how was that?
That was easy, because we would get tankers of water from a local well, so we just measured it in tankers and then broke it down to cubic meters in aggregate.
Right. Yeah, that sounds fairly straightforward, the way that was done. I guess with only one time of rainfall per year, it's
not that hard.
It's easier.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there was another one more about the specific techniques used. So there's Steve asking about water harvesting ditches and swales on contour and stone bunds. And he's asking, to compare the methods, if you can kind of explain the benefits or the detriments of some of them, and which you have a preference for.
Well, it's different structures for different geography. When you're looking at that stuff, you're looking at slope, you're looking at soil type, you're looking at what do you have the resources for. We never had to buy anything because we had the stone, right? So use the stone, it's free, it's there. It depends on your runoff coefficient, which is a little harder to calculate, but a runoff coefficient essentially tells you, if you get this many millimeters of rainfall in this amount of time, how much runoff do you have to deal with? And the right resources to follow up on that stuff are from the Quivira Coalition in the southwestern US. They've done really good material on earthworks in riparian corridors, and Brad Lancaster's books as well. We don't have time to go into detail on how do you know which one to do where and how big, because it gets complicated fairly quickly.
Detail there, yeah. And a lot of
the name of the organization is the Quivira Coalition. They're spelled with a Q. That's what it is. Yeah, they do phenomenal work in the southwestern US.
Oh, we can, oh, there it is. Yeah, thanks for typing it in. Quivira Coalition.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
That being said, I will jump to another question. Somebody asked, what would I do differently? I would have doubled the size of my swales easily, and probably planted within them on the borders rather than on the outside. And by doubling the size, I mean I would have made them twice as wide and probably had a shallower berm on the downhill side. I would have had less erosion that way and been able to plant more trees and wouldn't have had as much water running off of my site.
Yeah, so you'd be able to capture more water with the,
Yeah.
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 Okay, that's a good one as well. The lessons learned. There's another question about water retention by Ben, more about flat land.
Yeah.
And if there's, let's see, he's working with a walled hospital compound in Egypt with 10 acres of very flat land. And I'm just reading through the question. He's saying, I'm guessing our best bet might be to use irrigation from the main water supply to establish ground cover, which in turn will act as a sponge for the little amount of rain we receive each year, 18 millimeters.
80, Ben? Where's Ben? Is he in here?
There was someone from Egypt, I think, that you saw, but I don't know if Ben is here.
I mean, the short answer is that's not enough information to really go by. But I suspect that most of the water they've got access to is gray water, right? So create a gray water budget, figure out what you can grow with it. And it doesn't matter if it's 10 acres or 1 acre. Your limiting factor isn't how much land you've got, but how much water you've got. So you design around the water rather than around the land.
Right. And is there any other like earthworks, because the land is flat, does that make it, like, is there?
I mean, there's things like imprinting, where you get these big machines with a really funny looking roller that creates these inundations in the land that alternate. It's kind of like a mechanized small Xy hole kind of thing. There's lots of things that can be done. It's just a question of what does the context call for.
Right. Yeah, you said more information would be needed.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's say more broad question from Velmoed was if there's any place or biome that you wouldn't dare to regenerate. Well, I think you've taken on a huge challenge already, so I don't know if there's any places where you wouldn't go.
High deserts are really challenging. Not to say that I wouldn't go there, but high deserts are really tough because then you've got to deal with cold and heat and drought, whereas we just had heat and drought. I think places like the Mongolian steppe, somebody asked me what I'd do in the Gobi Desert once, and I was like, I have no idea because I've never been there, but that place looks tough, right? In the Gobi is a desert because there's no water in the air reaching that area. It's not because of desertification. It's not because water doesn't reach that spot. And when it does, it's often in snow. And so I think the Gobi is probably the hardest place on the planet.
Right. So maybe you would still go and see the possibilities, but perhaps those are not the best places to start anyway.
I mean, deserts are bad places to start in general. I don't recommend it, to be honest. The only advantage deserts have is that when you actually manage to pull something off, it looks phenomenal, right? The change in state is so viscerally palpable to people that they get it. Like if I worked in Iowa, right, and I changed the cornfield into a silvopasture, for instance, it's not going to look all that different, right? People aren't going to look at it and be like, oh wow, that's really something. That's the only advantage deserts have. Everything else is harder.
Yeah, definitely, like as the images in your video as well, they just speak volumes and they just bring the message across of what's possible. So yeah, I hear that, absolutely. There was I think there was one question at least about local people, and I saw one in the chat also about involvement of women.
Yeah.
You worked with the team there, and I think they were paid, but can you explain a little bit more if they were also volunteering, and how was that collaboration?
There was limited volunteering from the cities, but there was no volunteering from the part of the Bedu. One, because they're already dealing with a fair amount of poverty, and I don't want to ask poor people to volunteer time when they could be out making money. And so the founders of the project, the two princesses, funded the labor. They paid for the labor. And so in terms of working with women, that wasn't something I was able to do. It's just not culturally appropriate, and would have created a tremendous number of problems. But I did have I did have a project manager named Mayan Zawawi, who's just a really great lady who did do projects with the women related to local crafting and children's psychology and education and literacy programs. So yeah, that was there for a good part of the project, run by my friend Mayan, but that wasn't me. I couldn't touch it, and I never could have.
Yeah, I think you're already moving in a culture that's so different from your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just
Yeah,
have to.
and it wasn't our objective to try to do any kind of cultural engineering.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just quickly looking at the chat if there was related questions to this, but perhaps it would be interesting also to just share the main lesson that you learned of working with a community like that in terms of the social and the cultural aspect.
The main lesson, I would say, the most important thing I did my first 3 years there was gain trust. The world runs on trust, and these are an isolated and rather, I don't want to say xenophobic, because they're actually extremely hospitable. As long as they perceive that you are a guest and not a rival tribe or a competitor for something. And so the developing trust and all the pieces that went into that were critical, and probably the most important thing that I did to make that project successful.
Yeah, amazing. Just quickly peeking if there's more questions related to that. I think not so much. We could go back to a question about grazing, because that is obviously related to the people living there. How is the state of Al-Baida at the moment considering grazing? Is it allowed? Is it managed? And if so, how? And whether the site, if it's not ready yet, how do you know when it is?
It's ready now. It's not being grazed. Actually, it should have been grazed on some kind of cycle starting 2 or 3 years ago. But I wasn't there, and they don't have anybody there. I would have loved to hire Precious or somebody from the Savory Institute, or to take men there to get trained. But that hasn't happened. In terms of the rest of El Beida, in terms of the region, it's just a terrible state of things. Anybody can graze anything at any time, and it's a complete ecological catastrophe.
Right. Yeah, because there used to be an indigenous system that is no longer in place.
That's right. That's right.
There's a question about that, actually, to segue.
Welcome to the first episode.
Oh, someone's playing my
Sustainable
thing.
Design
Someone's
Master.
watching it. Somebody asked a question about the indigenous land use. Where is it?
Yeah.
There are loads of questions coming in, so sorry if I can't keep up with all of them, and also people
Rolling.
sharing some links I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, Adib, how do you protect such a large site from grazing animals?
Fencing.
Fencing. Yeah.
Lots of fencing.
What kind of fencing did you use?
We had to get really creative with our fencing because chain link was really expensive for whatever reason. So on the floodplain, we put up a giant berm that doubled as our final water catchment structure. This berm was probably 4 meters tall. And then we ran razor wire across the top of it. We used a bulldozer to create a flat space on top and compress it a bit so that it would have some structural soundness to it. And then we ran razor wire across the top and held it down with stone and some posting.
Wow.
In the mountain, we created a 3-mile long or 3-kilometer long stone platform that ran all up around the mountain and then did razor wire on top of that. That took us the better part of the summer of 2011 to build. Took us 3 to 4 months.
Incredible amount of.
Yeah, absolutely essential. If you want to control animals, you need fences.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I had a question from Kareem that he asked earlier as well. Yeah, why and how did you and Mr. Lawton select this site in particular?
Yeah, so there were 4 major criteria that we were looking for on this site. One was access, right? We needed to be able to get there easily from the road. So it's quite close to the one paved road that goes through El Beda. Another was visibility. We wanted it to be for people to be able to see it from different places where they would frequent. Third was we wanted it to be indicative of the rest of the geography of the area, right? So we didn't want someone to come and say, oh, you took the best land and that's why you were able to do this, right? We picked run-of-the-mill, standard, this is what everybody else has kind of stuff. We wanted it to be a complete watershed, albeit a small one, right? We needed to be able to have a fractal of the geography of the region. Mountains, wadis, and a floodplain, because that is the foundational pattern that sets how water and land interact with each other. So we needed a watershed, but it couldn't be too big or else it would have been way too much money to try to develop it. And it couldn't be too small because we needed to show that, yeah, it's actually applicable. And then finally, it needed to be kind of politically neutral. So there's a tribe directly north of that site and a tribe directly south. And we were on a piece where they actually kind of fought over who it belonged to. And so through the magistrate, we were able to take this and say, okay, you've been fighting over this. Stop fighting because it's none of yours. And so it allowed us to avoid the charge that we were favoring one tribe over the other, or that we had taken something from one tribe or the other. Because if one of the tribes had come and said, hey, you took our land, the other tribe would have come and said, no, that's not yours. They didn't take it from you. And so there was some politics there as well that had to be incorporated into the land search.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of factors there. It almost sounds a little miraculous that there weren't any huge problems in that sense.
But we had some serious social capital. We had the governorate's support. We had the magistrate's support. And one of our princesses is from a very, very prominent branch of the family.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that you have those people backing you up, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and last of all, we didn't want there to be people there. We wanted something that everybody else thought was pretty worthless, and we didn't want to kick anyone off. Like we didn't want to hurt somebody in the early steps of starting this project.
Right, and the team working there were from local villages, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. There's also a few questions about your business.
Mm-hmm.
So you have your company, Regenerative Resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that? How did you set it up and the type of clients you work with?
We set it up last year. It's a startup at this point, and we have it's not that we have clients per se. We partner with landholders on degraded landscapes to make those productive, and so we are a designer and developer, but we're also intending to commercialize the products that come off of these systems. And so we have projects in the pipeline with a communal landholder. So it's essentially a fishing village that owns this land. That's a desert along the coast of Mexico, and we'll be transforming that into a mangrove wetland. We're hoping to plant about 25 million mangroves next year. And then we will manage that to produce all sorts of stuff that we sell, and then the landholders and our company split the profits on that. So that's how we're approaching that. So in terms of how do we do that, we do have people contacting us and saying, hey, we may have a project. Send them questionnaires and things to fill out as kind of a pre-qualifying aspect of that. But we have currently we have requests like that from Colombia and Mozambique and the Horn of Africa region. And we're in the middle of this project development in Mexico and 2 projects in the US.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of projects going on. How big is your team actually? I'm curious.
We're quite small. We're 6 people.
Okay.
And that's because we partner a lot with local organizations. It's all very multi-stakeholder kind of stuff. And so to the extent possible, we're partnering with local contractors, local subcontractors, local NGOs, as well as local government.
Yeah, maybe that ties into the question of Peter. He says what kind of work you would prefer not to do, what kind of clients you would prefer not to work for.
Well, there's a whole lot of paperwork and administration and politics that go into the project development side of things, like laying the political and social foundation for these things, which I don't find to be particularly fun, but it's critical and necessary. I like getting my hands dirty. That's the fun part. I like being with people, planting trees. And I like the design. Design is super fun. And it's fun to see what the possibilities of a landscape can be. But in terms of clients, I mean, the most important thing is ability and willingness to pay. And the second most important thing is, does it fit, our ethics and our objectives? We're only doing regenerative developments. We're only doing things on degraded landscapes where we're not messing with an already existing ecology, or where we're not feeding into an extractive or a destructive process.
And has that happened, that there's been such a project proposal that you thought you really disagree with?
I mean, there have been touches in that sense where people have been like, hey, can you help us figure out how to do X? And we'll come back and say, actually, X is not what we do. But that's as far as it goes, right? Because anyhow, we'll leave it there.
Okay, sure. A more practical question on that, more about budget from Kareem. If there was, I'm not quite sure what he means with the question, but I think he's here. So is there an overview of the budget of this project over the last 10 years?
I'm guessing Kareem wants to know how much it would cost so that he can do it in Morocco. Is that right, Kareem?
Yeah, I was wondering, because you mentioned somewhere in the video how much it would cost to regenerate the whole coastline, and I was just wondering, okay, the result is great, but is it possible to do something like this in Morocco, for example? Like, what kind of budget would you need?
It is possible. My good friend Byron Joel actually was part of an early project in, I don't remember what part of Morocco he was in, but he's got experience there. I mean, what it would cost for you is a quite complicated question. I will say that 90% of our costs were labor. But that's not because 90% of your costs are going to be labor everywhere. That's because the princesses who funded the project wanted to give people jobs as part of this thing, right? Like that was a big push for them, was let's give these people employment, let's get them job skills, let's help them figure out how work actually works, because none of them had an employee kind of situation before.
So it was 90% funded project. Like,
no, they funded 100% of it through contacts that they had. I mean, they would go out and do fundraising, right? It wasn't all out of their pocket, but 90% of those costs were labor.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's
that being said, in terms of, you know, the west coast of Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about 30 million acres of land, right? At $2,000 an acre of development, which is not that much, you're still talking about $60 billion, right? It's just a question of scale. And 2,000 per acre might be doable. It actually feels a little low to me, but the bigger the project, the cheaper it is per acre. So hard to say at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's actually quite nice to have people ask their questions themselves. There's lots in the chat as well.
Who's CS asked from Ethiopia?
Oh yeah, that's me, Imran.
Hi, Imran.
Good to meet you, man. Pleasure.
You're in Ethiopia?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we've got early touches in Ethiopia, and we're working on a project in Somaliland.
You said early touches?
Yeah.
Is that a name of organization?
No, it's the name of people, actually. You may be
Okay.
familiar
Early
with
touches.
you may be familiar with a seawater project in Eritrea that was done 15,
Okay.
20 years ago. If you look up Greening Eritrea on YouTube, those are my partners.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, greening. Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's cool.
Where they did seawater agricultures and mangrove agroforestries, and so that's a big part of what we're doing, are these seawater systems on desert coastlines.
That's beautiful. Oh, that's great.
So we're looking at partnerships in Djibouti and Somaliland right now. And
Has Ethiopia been receptive in your eyes to restoration?
I mean, I don't know well enough to answer that question. I understand there are
Fair
some really
enough.
phenomenal projects there, but I'm not familiar with them on an intimate level.
Very fair. Thank you.
Actually, yeah, a question from Ashley was, what would be your words of advice to the students as people that are starting out as designers?
Start small and make a lot of mistakes. If you start small, then your mistakes are small and they won't be very costly. But that's how you get to learn your context. And if you start big and you don't know what you're doing, then you make big mistakes and it becomes very costly. So do lots of small experiments that aren't going to cost you that much when you're like, oh, okay, that doesn't work, and then you can figure out why, and then that leads you to what works.
Yeah, having a steep learning curve, I suppose.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, if you've taken a PDC and an ERC course, like you're at the very, very beginning of starting to understand. How many of you have taken a PDC, by the way?
I guess, yeah, you can raise your hand if that's a yes for you.
A handful.
I see.
There's a common pattern that, and I blame permaculture teachers in general for this, where, you know, you take a 2-week course and you're like, okay, I'm going to go change the world and teach permaculture, but you're really just at a very, very, very beginning stage, unless you're like a botanist or a soil scientist or something already. And so you start small, make a lot of mistakes, and just be open to that, because nature will give you the feedback you need to figure out the right thing to do.
Yeah, great. I really like that your comment in the video as well, that you appreciated the feedback from nature.
Yeah. And even on that site in Albeda, there are millions of mistakes that show up in that video, right? You can't tell from looking at it, but if I were to go back now, having spent a decade already doing it, it would look a lot different and it would be a better result.
Yeah, it's a lot of pioneering work as well, I imagine.
And yes, go to an ERC camp. That's a great place to go and make mistakes.
Yeah, totally. You can find one that is, you know, the same ecosystem that you may want to restore, options all over the world. Yeah, there's also a question about long-term management. So, so Meg, maybe Meg, you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering how you set up a management entity that can do the maintenance and control the grazing, and particularly after you leave and after the funding dries up.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Those are great questions. The short answer is, one of my most important jobs was preparing people to take over for me, because I was never going to be there the whole time, right? And I didn't know if I was going to be there 3 years or 6 years or a decade. And so one of my main personal objectives was set up my deputies and the people who performed really well to take over for me. There's a real problem with creating projects based on the charisma of an individual, right? Which, you know, happens frequently, but they're not sustainable. There has to be form and function and structure put to the human side of things, or else it falls apart. And then
when you left this project, oh, sorry, I was just going to ask if you'd actually figured out a way to, I don't know, commercialize this or find ways that people could be making money from this at that point when you left, so they could see that the more they did, the more they would be able to earn from it.
Yeah, I mean, we did studies on that, but that site's not big enough to commercialize anything. And it was a prototype, right? It was a prototype. And so even with the grazing aspect of it, it's not that we've reestablished a sustainable grazing system there. It's that we've proven that we can get the land to a point that it will support a grazing system again. Traditionally, those grazing systems were on a 4-year cycle. So you'd have camels come across a particular piece of land, or goats or whatever it may be, and they wouldn't come back for 4 more years, because that's how difficult that land is. And so on a 90-acre watershed, that's puny, right? It can support a handful of goats. And so the results of that were not that that's a commercially viable site. The results of that are that we've proven it can be done. This is what it should look like. Here are the components, and these are the products that can come off of it, right?
But you're still going to need some labor to continue to maintain the structures and, I suppose, manage any kind of grazing use in the future. So
Grazing will
without
definitely have to
funding,
be managed. Yeah,
we do that.
grazing will have to be managed. Maintenance on the structures is minimal. I mean, the buildings need maintenance more than anything else. The rest of it, the swales will need maintenance because they can't have perennial ground cover all of the time, probably on a 3 or 4 year type of thing. But it was intentionally designed to be as maintenance free as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much. I saw a question from Jane about replication of the project.
Yeah.
Jane is also on the call on the session.
Have they started replicate the template? So many of the Bedu have taken seed from the species of trees that were successful off of our site and started planting in their backyard, so to speak. Their backyards are enormous. They're square kilometers of land. And in terms of, a commercial site, the governor of Mecca allocated a 7,000 acre range that we were going to go develop. And currently that's still moving through the political process of all the different ministries that have to approve that land transfer. So that is in process, but it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, thank you. Just looking at that, I mean, yeah, is there anything that you wanted to add to any of these topics yourself?
I would say this. Someone asked about the most important lesson learned from the social thing. Once you know how to read land and you've got some understanding of what you ought to be doing, the land part is actually quite easy. The people part is extremely difficult. It will always be the most difficult. And we tend to look at it quite differently, actually. Like, you're here because you want to learn how to heal land, and healing land definitely has a learning curve to it and a process that's specific to your geography and your latitude and your climate and all that stuff. But once you've got that down and you understand the patterns, it becomes quite simple. The people are never simple. It will never be simple to get people organized and to get them working towards something. It's extremely hard. And the people part will always be the hardest part.
And the skills that you develop in terms of working with people, is it just kind of happened naturally working in the field, or have you taken certain courses or lessons from people?
I went into Albeda with a deep knowledge of the culture already, and the language. I was already fluent in Arabic when I moved out there. And I have an entire framework on how management needs to be tied to cultural preferences of leadership, which is not published anywhere, and I haven't shared it. I shared it once at a conference in 2015. But the development of that system and that approach came through me living in Guatemala when I was younger, when I was in my 20s, and then living in Egypt, and then just kind of observing things. I had a thesis around it going into Albeda, and then that thesis was refined.
Yeah.
But I already mentioned trust. Like my first objective was get people to trust me. And that's kind of the start of it. The other piece of it is, in every culture we tell stories about heroes, and the stories that we tell end up being templates around the kind of leadership that we prefer. So for instance, Americans talk about Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, and those stories illustrate the kind of values that we prefer in our leadership. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's stories about Salahuddin and Muhammad, and they exhibited very, very different leadership values that people there prefer. And so there's this whole culture of how should a leader act, what should a leader be, and then that informs how you decide to manage people and organizations.
Yeah, so I guess for anyone it will be more challenging to go to a completely new culture, but not impossible, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course there is ways that you can learn these types of participatory collaboration skills as well, but then have to be adapted to the culture.
Yeah.
I was just looking at the question from Neal, but did you want to add something to that?
No, I was just going to answer these real quick. Date palms do not survive on our site. Date palms are actually pretty water intensive. To establish date palms, we needed 40 liters of water a day for the first 40 days. And then we needed 40 liters a week, every week after that. That's the standard, which we did with a couple date palms and they still died. But in terms of, there's this concept of crop per drop, right? Where if water is your limiting factor, then you want to make sure that it's going to the most productive systems possible. My moringa trees, I only needed to give them 5 liters of water a week rather than 40 liters of water a day, right? So that's what, 280 liters of water for one date palm, 5 liters of water for one moringa. And a moringa will give you half the production of a date palm for 2% of the water or something like that. And so it just, if I can plant 40 moringas for every date palm, I'm going to plant 40 moringas because we didn't have any scarcity of land. It was scarcity of water.
Yeah, so it's a straightforward calculation, really.
Yeah, it's a crop per drop rather than a production per acre metric, right? Most farmers go on a production per acre metric, which is why all of our aquifers around the planet are being depleted.
Yeah.
But if we're on a crop per drop metric, then it changes things fundamentally, right?
Yeah, of course. There's a question about your restoration experience prior to this project.
Yeah, I had none. No previous experience. I was working an office job doing Arabic media analysis before this. So I would read all the newspapers out of Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt and write reports on them for the State Department. That's what I was doing before this. And I would read about sustainability for fun. I was deeply passionate about sustainability in the built environment and sustainability in food systems. So I had a lot of book knowledge and a lot of theory, but no practice. And the people who founded the project, the princesses who founded this, they were looking for an Arab Muslim guy to take on this project. And I don't think they found one. And so I think they figured that a Mormon was the next best thing. And then I knew the culture and I knew the language and they were like, okay, this is the best thing we've got. We'll go with this guy.
Great choice. It worked out. So this was your first practical restoration project.
That's accurate.
Yeah, that's very inspiring actually. Means we can
got
all
some help from Jeff, didn't you?
Yeah.
So I had Jeff on site for 2 weeks. Very, very, very early. I also, so when they tried to hire me, I said, you need to pay for my PDC and then I want Jeff as a consultant early on. That's what I said.
This is Jeff Lawton for anyone who's not.
Yeah. And so I did my PDC with Jeff. I had already read the permaculture design manual and a whole bunch of other related things, but I wanted a PDC. And then Jeff was on site for 2 weeks, where we picked the demonstration site together the first week, did some very, very early design, and then that was it. It was enough to get me started, to be honest. It was enough to get started. It wasn't enough to get to the end. And so I was continuously learning on the job and continuously studying in my free time.
So when you say it wasn't enough,
at least for the first few years, right? 3 or 4 years of daily study on all sorts of materials relevant to what we were doing.
yeah, and that is what got you to the end. When you say it wasn't enough to get me to the end, the studying in between and all the learning.
Yeah. I mean, Jeff got me started. He was enough to get me started, and I appreciate that. But we haven't worked together since, and there you have it. I would say, well, I've got all sorts of materials I can recommend if you want to do that later.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, if you're talking about like reading materials and books and so on.
It's all context specific though, right? If you're in Ethiopia versus the UK versus Minnesota, it's all going to be different stuff, right? I can talk in depth about deserts, but not about UK forestry or anything like that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I mean, we have lots of resources that we offer on the course for each topic. So I was thinking we could add to that, but we have quite a list on deserts as well.
I think the desert model was like so good. You gave it a special touch. Have to give it to you. Your knowledge is good, man.
Was that Imran?
All of the
Thanks,
all of the
Imran.
teachers are great, but so you have something interesting that I was liking. I like the information.
Appreciate it.
That's really great to hear. Amazing. So I see it's at 7 o'clock here in Europe. I don't know if there is any, I mean, there's been lots of questions in the chat. I feel like we've covered most of them. Is there anything that like still really wants to be asked right now? Maybe you can raise your hand. That could be a nice way to...
I've budgeted 25 more minutes for this, so we can keep going. If you folks want to keep going.
Yeah.
I do remember seeing some questions on the Facebook page. We have no way to measure soil. Well, when we started out, someone asked about soil. I remember seeing.
Yeah, you're right.
When we got our first soil sample tested, it came back 99.9% silicates. No biological material whatsoever.
Wow.
And where that changed was in the microclimates we created. I didn't see ants on our site until 2014. I started in 2010. Took 4 years for ants to show up. The first time I heard crickets instead of just flies was 2013. Took 3 years for crickets to show up.
It's amazing that they did, though.
Well, and when you create habitat for stuff, you're like, hey, here's a home.
But
Move
the fact
them
that they
in.
can find it.
And then they find it because they're looking for a home, right? And so it's really a remarkable thing. Termites are the earthworms of the desert. They're one of the only things that will biodegrade woody material. We didn't have termites until 2015. I was super happy when I found termites on our site.
So they came, like I said, I thought maybe they were somehow introduced as well as a way to...
We didn't introduce anything.
Nothing, okay.
We didn't introduce anything, except we just moved rocks around so that the water would act differently. And we did plant trees, clearly. But even in our pigeon house, we built the pigeon house. We never bought any pigeons. There's 12 pair of pigeons living in there right now. We don't feed or water them. Right. And so it's a really weird thing because pigeons are a great desert crop, by the way, because they're tasty and they're really low maintenance. and they give you valuable guano. But it's such a weird metric where we were like, well, how many pigeons do we have living? Because that's an indicator of our ecological health.
Yeah.
You know, that's not a metric any kind of ecological scientist would ever, you know, publish on or go by, but it was something that we could use for ourselves.
And that, are they eating the insects that are now there?
I don't know what they're eating. They're eating whatever pigeons eat. The bats are definitely eating insects. We built a bat house big enough for 8,000 bats. And I saw 2 bats in there a month after we had completed construction. And then we sealed up that door and left an entry and exit for bats, and I haven't looked in since. It may be that they've abandoned it. It may be that there's 1,000 bats living in there. I really don't know. But they'll move in eventually. Once the ecology has reached a point where it'll support them, they'll move in because it's a perfect bat house.
Mm.
So did you use, there was not that many bats in the beginning, so you didn't per se use that?
No, there are, especially in the winter. There are 17 species of bat in Saudi Arabia, and it's one of the only sources of phosphorus that you can get without buying phosphate fertilizers. And that's also what the pigeons are good for, and chicken manure. We got a couple truckloads of chicken manure when we were planting to compost. The bats are there for pest consumption primarily. They eat flies and mosquitoes, which I hate, and of which there are a lot. And then there are some that do nocturnal pollination, right, for plants that flower at night. And then it's valuable high phosphate guano.
So someone was asking about the organic matter levels now. Have you done soil tests recently?
No, I haven't done a soil test since 2014.
Do you not really want to, though? You're not really curious?
I mean, I am, but it wasn't our driving objective. Like, no one's ever gonna, there's no carbon market in Saudi Arabia. You know?
I know, but it's a way to show what's possible.
And it's the soil creation won't really take off until there is sustainable grazing there.
Mm.
Like there is now mulch everywhere because of the trees dropping leaves, and that's helped cool the soil. But ruminants are critical for the mineral cycle in dry lands.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I had a defunct blog where I posted a picture of the carcass of a camel. And I'd been driving by this camel carcass every day for 3 years, and it hadn't biodegraded. It looked the same in 2015 as it did in 2012, right? And the reason why not is because there's no water in the air or in the soil. And so there's no bacteria to biodegrade that carcass. Like I could have tanned it 2 years after it died. It would have been disgusting, but I still would have had camel leather. For biodegradation to happen, you need a moist, bacteria-rich climate. And the only moist, bacteria-rich climate in the desert is in the stomach of a goat or a camel or a water buffalo. That's where stuff biodegrades. You don't have biodegradation otherwise, except on very, very minimal scales, right? Like with termites. Termites will biodegrade woody material, but not for 4,000 trees worth of woody material, right? And so in order to have a functioning mineral cycle in the desert, you actually need ruminants. You need herbivores that are gonna break down that woody and plant material into manure where all those nutrients then become bioavailable to the plants again. And that's one of the most brilliant insights that Alan Savory had. in his book Holistic Management, is that you don't have a functioning mineral cycle in deserts without ruminants. And so soil creation at this point, it's mostly in the form of insects and birds and lizards, which is minimal. But the fact that there's now like a mulch covering, which keeps soils cooler, is a critical part of that. But the biodegradation doesn't really happen until you get ruminants back on the land.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to learn more about how that exactly is done in the next module as well.
Precious will be talking all about that stuff.
Yes, totally. Yeah, in much detail, and yeah, it will be very interesting. Yeah, and there was a question about, well, it's a question from Karim, but that's going back to methodology. So maybe the answer will be it kind of depends. But he has a project on 10 hectares. Or maybe you ask your question yourself, Karim.
Yeah, no problem. Our project is 10 hectares of degraded oasis, and was used to be agricultural land, but like 20 years ago. But now, kind of the sand took over, but it's still flat land. And my question is, what is the best method to use to catch water on the land?
Yeah, I'd be remiss to recommend anything to you over the internet. I do have a webinar on YouTube called 10 Keys to Greening Any Desert, where I go through a big chunk of my processes that would answer that question that you have. What it comes down to is, A, why is your oasis degraded in the first place? Like, what's going on? But B, where are you in your watershed? Like, do you get runoff? Do you only get rain and then it's running off of your site? And how much is it? And what's going on ecologically and socially are the things that would inform an answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. I will check it out.
But that webinar is on YouTube. It's free. Nobody knows about it, but it'll be helpful.
Would you say it's also to do with observing what happens when it rains in the same way that Brad Lancaster did?
Yeah, because it's a question of, do you have water running through your site? Do you have water running off your site? Or do you have water running onto your site? Because all of that will dictate what you should do.
Yeah, there's an interesting question actually about this original indigenous system, the Bedouin system.
Yeah.
Yeah, how did that work, or what was it already ecologically degraded in their time as well?
No, the Himma. So Himma is Arabic. It kind of means protected area. But this is a system that predated Islam. It's from at least 500 BC, if not earlier. And it was a tribally managed system. So for instance, if you were the Inga tribe, right? And you've got so much land and the land looks like this, you would allocate areas of that to, this is for the warriors' horses. This is for the tribal leaders' camels. This part is for this family's goats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you broke those rules, if you brought your sheep onto a piece of land during a time when they're not supposed to be there, you would have 10% of your flock confiscated by the tribe and you'd get whipped. All right, so very serious penalties for not following the rules that dictated how grazing and the land interacted with each other. Okay, and this preserved the fertility of much of Arabia's land, and it was the whole Jazeera, the whole Arabian peninsula, all the way up into Syria and over into Iraq. This was a system that kind of tribally dominated much of this landscape for a long, long time. And they managed their grazing in order to preserve the fertility of the land. Now, the reason that was abolished is because nation states came along and they don't like that it's tribes managing all the land because they view tribes as a threat, right? You can't, if you have a strictly tribal society, tribes own all the land, that means they own a lot of the economy and they have a lot of power. And so what you do is you say, okay, all the tribal boundaries are gone now. That's what happened in the 1950s as an effort to bolster the nation states. And this was in Saudi Arabia, this was in the Gulf, this was in the Sham. And when that happened, everyone interpreted this law to mean, okay, no more boundaries, no more consequences, anybody can graze anything at any time, and that's what's happening, right? So the Inga tribe is gone. You don't have an Inga tribe anymore. You don't get to control your land, and massive desertification is the result.
Yeah, and at the same time, that means we have a lot to learn from these indigenous and ancient methods, right? In restoration.
Yeah, I mean, the beautiful thing about many indigenous systems, not all of them, but there are many where, because the people viewed themselves as a part of their ecology, right? They didn't have this false distinction of there's people and then there's nature over there, right? They viewed themselves as an integral part of nature. And that led to the development of systems that allowed them to maintain an ecological function and maintain ecologies. And it's not necessarily that we need to go back to thousands of year old systems, but we do need to go back to viewing ourselves as a fundamental part of nature. Because that distinction is false. And the reliance that we have on ecological health is it's entire, it's complete. We without, you know, soil, which comes from ecologies, none of us are alive. We're completely reliant on it, and we've developed systems that destroy ecologies, that destroy soil, that destroy our riparian areas, that create dead zones in our oceans, because we think we're different from it. We think it doesn't affect us because we're separate, and we're not separate. And so the one of the primary theses of my work is that if you can tie wealth back into ecological function, then you create incentives and a foundation for establishing new indigenous patterns.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really important. And I think every practitioner so far has really emphasized this, that we are a part of nature, and it's so important for everyone to remember that. I kind of wanted to round it up with one last question, which is a broad one. Someone asked, what is your view on ecological restoration on a global scale, the future of it?
Well, it's only been in the last generation that we've realized as a species that we're really mucking things up. This is not, it's not been in our conscious for very long that our impact on the planet is significant. And that we are over extracting and essentially reducing the carrying capacity of Earth. That's what we're doing. There's less life on Earth now than there was 300 years ago. And so what first emerged from understanding that problem was, oh, conservation. We need to create areas where people don't go because people are bad, and we're going to conserve these areas. And that's what gets protected. But everything else we're going to keep destroying, right? We're going to destroy everything else, but what's conservation, that's what we protect. And which is important. Conservation is really important. I don't want to downplay the importance of that. But what it's done is it's created this mindset that, okay, we're going to protect that over there, and whatever we're doing here, you know, we're going to destroy it, or at least that's what we're doing, whether or not that's a conscious statement. And inevitably, because of things like Jivan's paradox, because of things like human greed, that concept's going to collapse. It's not going to succeed in saving what we need to save. And so I don't want to go into Jivan's paradox right now, but it's a crucial concept that essentially states that if all we're trying to do is increase the efficiency with which we destroy stuff or with which we consume, right? This whole lower your footprint concept, all that does is it makes space for more people. It doesn't actually solve the problem. If we're more efficient, we're just destroying the earth more slowly, but we haven't actually stopped destroying the earth. And so what I am pushing for in my work and kind of my life purpose and what I'm going to be doing till the day I die is saying, yes, we need conservation where apex predators and keystone species can do their thing. But on everything else, we need regenerative systems, right? We can't, and primarily with agriculture, most of our land use is agriculture. And the way agriculture works right now, it's incredibly destructive. And a lot of people come back with, well, can you feed the world with this system? Which is, it's a bullshit question, to be completely frank, because that question assumes that we can feed the world with the systems we've got now. We can't feed the world if we destroy all of our soil. We can't feed the world if we continue to create dead zones in our oceans. We're losing billions of tons of fish every year to dead zones, right? We can't feed the world if we continue to deforest and desertify everything, because what we're doing is we're completely limiting our potential to grow food in the future, right?
Yeah.
And so my view is we need conservation, and everywhere else we need regenerative systems.
Oh, got one.
That's my view.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think everyone, at least here, is very aware that we need to restore and we need to get on it now. So yeah, I'd say thank you so much for sharing all this additional wisdom and all your ideas and the lessons you've learned by, yeah, all your hard work, really. And I really hope that everyone got a lot of insight from this and inspiration. And yeah, let's stay in touch. We actually have a Facebook page now for all the alumni of the course, so it's the students of the course now. So you're welcome to join it as well. I don't know, you may get a lot of questions, but
I'm in there.
You're in there already. Great. So if you have any more questions,
I've got a little leaf by my name, which is a nice little trophy.
it means you're a pioneer restorer. You got to leave.
There you go.
Great. So we can continue the conversation if you have more questions. Yeah, so I just want to wish everyone an amazing weekend and ahead to the next week.
Thanks, everybody. Hope it's been a worthwhile 80 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a good night. Have a good day.